The auction block stood in the center of Millfield's dusty Main Street like a wooden gallows, and Martha Calloway knew she was meant to be its next victim. Sheriff William Crenshaw's voice carried across the gathered crowd with the authority of a man who had never questioned his right to decide the fate of others. "The Calloway Ranch debt stands at $847, he announced, his weathered hands gripping the legal papers that might as well have been her death warrant. "Property to be sold at public auction this coming Saturday, unless payment is made in full." Martha felt the weight of every eye in town pressing against her black mourning dress. The fabric clung to her shoulders in the October heat, and she could smell the mixture of horse sweat, tobacco, and unwashed bodies that always gathered when vultures sensed fresh carry-on. Her late husband's debts had been growing like tumbleweeds in a windstorm, but she had hoped for more time. "Now, Mrs. Calloway," Crenshaw continued, his pale blue eyes finding hers across the crowd. "Texas law gives you the right to keep your homestead if you can prove you're capable of working the land. But a woman alone..." He let the words hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The gathered ranchers and townsmen nodded their agreement. Samuel Hendricks, her brother-in-law, stepped forward with the eager stride of a man who smelled opportunity in tragedy. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. "Sheriff, I've been saying for months that Martha can't handle 3,000 acres by herself," Samuel called out, his voice pitched to carry to the back of the crowd. "She's got no sons, no hands willing to work for her. The ranch is dying under her management." Martha's jaw tightened. The truth was more complicated than Samuel's public performance suggested, but the law didn't care about complications. Texas statute required proof of adequate cultivation and maintenance to prevent foreclosure, and her dwindling bank account told only part of the story. "Mrs. Calloway," Sheriff Crenshaw said, stepping down from the platform to address her directly, "you have until Saturday to either pay the debt or demonstrate that you can maintain the property according to state requirements. That means active cattle operations, maintained fencing, and regular agricultural use of at least half your acreage." The sheriff's tone carried the weight of finality, but Martha caught something else beneath it. A hesitation, perhaps, or maybe just the discomfort of a man who preferred his authority to go unquestioned. "Sheriff," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "what exactly constitutes proof of maintenance under the statute?" Crenshaw's eyebrows rose slightly. Most widows didn't question the details of legal proceedings. "The law requires documented evidence of ongoing operations, livestock counts, fence repairs, crop yields if applicable. And who makes the determination of adequacy? The county assessor, under my supervision." Martha nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications. The law might be stacked against her, but it was still law, with procedures and requirements that could be met or challenged. Her late husband had taught her to read contracts and land deeds, skills that most women in Millfield lacked. "I understand, Sheriff. You'll have your proof by Saturday." The crowd stirred with murmurs of surprise and skepticism. Samuel's face darkened with something that might have been anger or fear. He stepped closer to Martha, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, despite the early hour. "Martha, be reasonable," he said in a voice pitched for her ears alone. "You can't run that ranch. Sell to me now, and I'll give you enough to start fresh somewhere else. San Antonio, maybe, or Austin. Someplace where a woman alone doesn't draw so much attention." The threat in his words was soft, but unmistakable. Samuel wanted the ranch, and he wasn't the only one. The Calloway spread sat on some of the best grazing land in the county, with access to the creek that never ran dry even in the worst drought years. "Thank you for the concern, Samuel, but I'll manage." Martha turned to face the crowd, knowing that her next words would determine whether she lived as a free woman or died as a pauper dependent on the charity of men who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be solved. "I'll meet the legal requirements by Saturday," she announced. "The Calloway Ranch will remain operational." The silence that followed her declaration felt heavier than the October heat. Then old Pete Garrison, who ran the feed store, let out a low whistle. "Lady's got sand, I'll give her that," he muttered. Sheriff Crenshaw folded the legal papers with deliberate precision. "Mrs. Calloway, I hope you understand what you're committing to. The law doesn't make exceptions for good intentions." "I understand perfectly, Sheriff." What Martha understood was that she had just bought herself 6 days to solve an impossible problem. Her cattle had been disappearing steadily for the past month, and her remaining hands had quit after claiming they'd seen things on the range that couldn't be explained by natural causes. The mysterious riders that appeared at night left tracks but no other evidence, and the local Mexican workers crossed themselves and spoke of los jinetes mudos, the silent horsemen. As the crowd began to disperse, Martha caught sight of Elena Vasquez standing near the blacksmith's shop. The older Mexican woman had worked as a cook and housekeeper for various ranches in the area, and her eyes held a knowledge that went beyond mere gossip. Elena nodded slightly when their gazes met, a gesture so small that Martha might have imagined it. The walk back to her horse felt longer than the 20 yards it actually covered. Each step reminded her of the weight she now carried, and the knowledge that failure would mean not just the loss of her home, but her complete dependence on the mercy of men who had already decided she was incapable of independence. Martha mounted her mare and turned toward home, but she could feel Samuel's eyes following her retreat. He would be planning already, calculating how to ensure her failure while keeping his hands clean. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it sparked something that felt almost like anticipation. She had 6 days to prove that a woman alone could maintain a working ranch in the face of supernatural harassment and human sabotage. The odds were impossible, but Martha had learned long ago that impossible odds sometimes created unexpected opportunities. The ride home took her past the cemetery where her husband lay buried beneath a simple wooden cross. She didn't stop, but she whispered a promise to the dusty ground. "I won't let them take what we built, Thomas. Not without a fight, they'll remember." By the time she reached the ranch house, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the fires she would need to build if she hoped to keep the wolves at bay for another night. That evening, as Martha sat on her porch reviewing the ranch's financial records by lamplight, she heard the sound that had been haunting her dreams for weeks. Hoofbeats in the distance, steady and rhythmic, but accompanied by no human voices or cattle calls. The sound grew closer, circled the house twice, then faded toward the east pasture. In the morning, she would find the tracks. Elena Vasquez's grandson, Miguel, approached the house just after sunrise, his hat in his hands and his young face creased with worry. He had been one of her few remaining workers, but Martha could see from his expression that he was about to join the exodus. "Senora Calloway," he began in careful English, "my grandmother, she says I should tell you something before I go." "You're leaving too, then?" Miguel's eyes dropped to his boots. "The other ranchers. They say anyone who works for you is cursed. They won't hire me if I stay." Martha nodded. She couldn't blame him for choosing survival over loyalty to a woman who might be dead or bankrupt within a week. "What did your grandmother want you to tell me?" "She says the silent riders, they don't come for the cattle. They come because someone called them. And she says you should look for the answer where the water never stops running, even in the dry season." Before Martha could ask what that meant, Miguel mounted his horse and rode away, leaving her alone with a mystery that might hold the key to saving her ranch or destroying what remained of her reputation. The water that never stopped running. Martha knew every inch of her land, every creek and spring and seasonal wash. There was only one place that fit Miguel's description, and it was also the place where most of the mysterious tracks had been found. Martha saddled her horse and rode toward the eastern boundary of her property, where the creek that gave the ranch its value curved through a stand of ancient mesquite trees. As she approached the water, she saw them, clear as day in the soft earth beside the creek bank. Hoofprints, dozens of them, forming a pattern that suggested riders moving in a deliberate circle around a central point. But there were no human footprints, no dropped equipment, no sign that anyone had dismounted or made camp. Just the endless loop of horses that might or might not have carried riders. Martha dismounted and walked to the center of the circle. The ground here was different, harder packed, as if it had been compacted by repeated use. She knelt and pressed her palm to the earth, and felt something that made her breath catch in her throat. The ground was warm, far warmer than it should have been in the cool morning air. And beneath her palm, she could swear she felt a rhythmic vibration, like a heartbeat echoing up from the depths of the earth itself. The courthouse steps felt like a stage where Martha's fate would be decided by men who had already written the final act. Judge Harrison Webb sat behind a makeshift desk that had been carried outside to accommodate the crowd that had gathered to witness what most assumed would be the widow's final humiliation. His black robes hung loose on his thin frame, and his eyes held the weary authority of a man who had spent 30 years deciding the fates of people who couldn't afford better representation. "Mrs. Calloway," Judge Webb began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of legal proceedings, "you've requested this hearing to demonstrate your compliance with state requirements for property maintenance. The burden of proof rests entirely with you." Martha stood before the makeshift tribunal in her best dress, the same black wool she had worn to Thomas's funeral 6 months earlier. She had spent the previous 3 days preparing for this moment, gathering documentation and witnesses, but she knew that success depended on more than paperwork. Sheriff Crenshaw sat to the judge's right, a stack of legal documents arranged precisely before him. Samuel Hendricks occupied a chair nearby, his presence a constant reminder that Martha's failure would be his opportunity. The gathered crowd included most of the town's prominent ranchers, their faces showing the skeptical interest of men watching a circus act they expected to end badly. "Your Honor," Martha said, stepping forward with the leather portfolio that contained her carefully prepared evidence, "I present documented proof of ongoing ranch operations for the past 6 months." She placed the first document on the judge's desk, a hand-drawn map showing the current locations of her remaining cattle. The numbers were smaller than they had been a year ago, but they met the minimum requirements for active ranching operations. 43 head of cattle currently grazing on marked sections of the property, she continued. Fence repairs completed on the north and west boundaries within the past month, with receipts for materials purchased from Garrison's Feed and Supply. Judge Webb examined the papers with the methodical attention of a man who had learned not to trust first impressions. "Mrs. Calloway, these numbers represent a significant decrease from your husband's operational levels. How do you explain the reduction?" The question hung into the air like smoke from a campfire, and Martha felt the weight of every eye in the crowd. This was the moment when she would either find a way forward or watch her world crumble into dust. "Your Honor, the reduction reflects market conditions and operational adjustments. However, the remaining livestock maintain adequate utilization of the grazing land as required by statute." It was a careful answer. True, but incomplete. The real reason for the reduced numbers lay in the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the ranch for months, but Martha couldn't prove supernatural cattle rustling in a court of law. Samuel Hendricks rose from his chair with the measured confidence of a man who had been waiting for his cue. "Your Honor, if I may address the court?" Judge Webb nodded, and Samuel stepped forward, his boots clicking against the courthouse steps with military precision. "Your Honor, I've been managing cattle operations in this county for 15 years. The Calloway Ranch is failing under Mrs. Calloway's management, and the evidence is clear to anyone who cares to look. Her remaining hands have quit, her cattle counts are dropping monthly, and she's been unable to maintain basic security on the property." Samuel paused, letting his words settle over the crowd like dust after a windstorm. "More importantly, Your Honor, there have been disturbances on the property that suggest Mrs. Calloway has lost control of the situation entirely." The murmur that rippled through the crowd carried undertones of fear and suspicion. Martha felt her chest tighten, as she realized Samuel was about to make the mysterious riders a matter of public record. "What kind of disturbances, Mr. Hendricks?" Judge Webb asked. "Unexplained activities at night, Your Honor. Tracks without sources, sounds that frighten livestock and workers alike. The Mexican hands speak of curses and supernatural interference. Whether or not such things exist, the practical result is that Mrs. Calloway cannot maintain a stable workforce or secure environment." Martha's hands clenched at her sides. Samuel had found a way to use the mystery against her without having to explain or prove anything supernatural. The court didn't need to believe in ghost riders. It only needed to acknowledge that belief in them made the ranch unworkable. "Your Honor," Martha said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Mr. Hendricks speaks of rumors and superstitions. Texas law requires proof of inadequate maintenance, not speculation about employee morale." Judge Webb leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "Mrs. Calloway, the law does require that property owners maintain adequate security and working conditions. If your employees are refusing to work due to safety concerns, that could indeed constitute grounds for finding the property inadequately maintained." The trap was closing around Martha like the jaws of a steel snare, but she had prepared for this moment. From her portfolio, she withdrew a document that represented her most desperate gamble. "Your Honor, I present a signed contract with Elena Vasquez, who has agreed to serve as ranch manager and primary livestock handler for a period of 1 year. Mrs. Vasquez has 30 years of experience in cattle operations and is willing to maintain full-time residence on the property." The crowd stirred with surprise. Elena Vasquez was known throughout the county as one of the most skilled ranch workers available, but she had never before agreed to work for a woman independently. Judge Webb examined the contract with raised eyebrows. "Mrs. Vasquez, are you present to confirm this arrangement?" Elena stepped forward from her position at the back of the crowd. She wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton that contrasted sharply with the weathered brown of her hands and face. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark eyes held the quiet authority of a woman who had earned respect through decades of competent work. Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor. I have agreed to work for Senora Calloway." "And you're aware of the alleged disturbances on the property?" Elena's expression didn't change, but Martha caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Your Honor, I have worked on many ranches. There are always challenges. I am not afraid of hard work or difficult conditions." Samuel Hendricks stood again, his face showing the first signs of genuine concern. "Your Honor, Mrs. Vasquez is certainly qualified, but one employee cannot constitute adequate staffing for a 3,000-acre operation." "Mr. Hendricks raises a valid point," Judge Webb said. "Mrs. Calloway, can you demonstrate that this arrangement provides sufficient labor for your operational needs?" Martha had expected this challenge, but her response required revealing information she had hoped to keep private. From her portfolio, she withdrew a final document, this one bearing the official seal of the county assessor's office. "Your Honor, I present a revised operational plan that reduces active ranching to 1,500 acres, with the remaining property held in reserve grazing. This arrangement meets all legal requirements while acknowledging current resource limitations." The document represented Martha's willingness to cut her operations in half, a sacrifice that would barely keep the ranch profitable but might satisfy the court's requirements. Judge Webb studied the papers with the thorough attention of a man who understood that his decision would set a precedent for other cases. "Mrs. Calloway, this revised plan appears to meet minimum legal standards, assuming Mrs. Vasquez can indeed fulfill her contractual obligations. However, the court must also consider the broader question of public safety and community stability." Martha felt the ground shifting beneath her feet like sand in an hourglass. "Your Honor, I'm not certain what you mean." "Mrs. Calloway, there have been complaints from neighboring ranchers about disturbances that seem to originate on your property. While the court cannot rule on the supernatural, it must consider the practical effects of such disturbances on the community." Sheriff Crenshaw leaned forward. his weathered hands clasped before him. "Your Honor, I've received multiple reports of unusual activities in the area around the Callaway Ranch. While I cannot verify the exact nature of these activities, they have created sufficient concern among local residents to warrant investigation." The sheriff's words carried the weight of law enforcement authority, and Martha realized that her legal victory might be meaningless if the court decided she represented a threat to community peace. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a desperation she tried to keep hidden, "I cannot be held responsible for the fears and superstitions of my neighbors. If there are actual crimes or violations of law on my property, I welcome investigation. But speculation and rumor cannot be grounds for legal action." Judge Webb was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between Martha, the documentation she had provided, and the faces of the crowd that had gathered to witness her judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of a man walking a tightrope between law and community pressure. "Mrs. Callaway, your documentation appears to satisfy the minimum legal requirements for property maintenance. However, the court is concerned about the ongoing disturbances and their effect on community stability." Martha's heart began to beat faster as she sensed the direction of the judge's thinking. "Therefore, the court will grant you a provisional approval, subject to monthly review for a period of 6 months. You will be required to submit detailed reports of all ranch activities, and any further complaints from neighboring properties will trigger immediate re-examination of this decision." The provisional approval was both victory and defeat, a legal limbo that kept her ranch but under constant scrutiny. Martha nodded her acceptance, knowing that she had won only the right to continue fighting. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena Vasquez approached with the quiet stride of a woman who had made her decision and intended to see it through. "Senora Callaway, we should speak privately about the work ahead." Martha nodded, but as they walked toward her horse, she caught Samuel's eye. His expression held the cold calculation of a man who had lost this battle, but not the war. That evening, as Martha and Elena sat on the ranch house porch discussing the practical details of their arrangement, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the eastern pasture. Elena's weathered hands stilled on her coffee cup, and her dark eyes turned toward the sound. "They come every night now," Martha said. "See. They are waiting." "Waiting for what?" Elena's answer came so quietly that Martha almost missed it over the sound of the wind through the mesquite trees. "For you to understand what they want." The hoofbeats circled the house 3 times, then faded toward the creek where Martha had found the warm earth and the endless tracks. As the sound disappeared into the night, Elena stood and walked to the edge of the porch, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the lamplight. "Senora Callaway, there are things about this land that your husband never told you. Things that the Mexican families have known for generations, but keep to themselves because the Anglo ranchers do not wish to hear them." Martha joined Elena at the porch rail, feeling the October wind cut through her shawl like a blade made of winter. "What kinds of things? Tomorrow, when the sun is high, I will show you. Tonight we should go inside and bar the doors. The riders, they are growing bolder." As if summoned by Elena's words, the hoofbeats returned, closer now, circling the house with a precision that suggested intelligence and purpose. Martha found herself counting the rhythm, noting the exact timing of each circuit, as if the pattern held some meaning she might eventually decipher. The sound stopped directly in front of the porch, and for a moment Martha could swear she heard breathing that was not quite human, though she could see nothing in the darkness beyond the reach of the lamp. The morning sun cast long shadows across the creek bed as Elena led Martha through the mesquite grove toward the place where the mysterious tracks converged. Elena moved with the purposeful stride of a woman who had walked this path before, her weathered boots finding secure footing on the uneven ground without conscious thought. "Your husband, he knew about the old agreement," Elena said as they approached the water's edge. "But he thought it was just Mexican superstition, something to humor the workers with, but not take seriously." Martha followed Elena to the exact spot where she had felt the warm earth and rhythmic vibrations. In the clear morning light, The circle of hoofprints seemed even more pronounced, worn deep into the ground by countless nights of repetition. What agreement? Elena knelt beside the creek and placed her palm flat against the packed earth at the center of the circle. When the Spanish first came to this valley, they made a deal with something that was already here. Something old, that had been watching over the water and the grass for longer than anyone could remember. The older woman's voice carried the weight of stories passed down through generations, tales that lived in the spaces between official history and documented fact. Martha knelt beside her, feeling again the strange warmth that seemed to pulse up from the earth itself. The Spanish called it El Guardián de las Aguas, the guardian of the waters. They promised to respect the old ways, to leave offerings at the sacred places, to never take more from the land than they gave back. In return, the guardian would protect their cattle and ensure the water never failed. Martha pressed her own palm to the warm earth, and this time she felt something more than vibration. A rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, as if the land itself was alive and aware of her presence. Elena, what does this have to do with the riders? When your husband bought this land from the Hernandez family, he inherited more than just the deed and the water rights. He inherited the obligation to honor the old agreement. But Thomas, he was a practical man. He stopped the offerings, cleared away the shrine stones, treated the water like it belonged to him alone. Elena stood and walked to a cluster of large stones near the creek bank. Martha had noticed them before, but assumed they were natural formations. Now, looking more closely, she could see that they had been deliberately arranged, forming a rough circle around a flat stone that might once have served as an altar. The guardian has been patient, but patience has limits. The riders come because the agreement has been broken, and the debt must be paid. Martha felt a chill despite the warming morning air. What kind of debt? The old ways required an offering every full moon and recognition of the guardian's authority over the water. Your husband stopped both 3 years ago, when he decided such things were beneath a modern American rancher. The pieces began to fall into place in Martha's mind, like cards in a collapsing house. The mysterious cattle disappearances, the frightened workers, the timing that had begun shortly after Thomas had dismissed the last of the old Mexican hands, who might have reminded him of traditional obligations. You're saying Thomas brought this on himself by ignoring some ancient contract with a supernatural guardian? Elena's dark eyes met Martha's with an expression that held both sympathy and warning. I am saying that some debts pass from husband to wife, and some agreements are older and stronger than the law that protects your ranch. A sound from the direction of the house interrupted their conversation. Hoofbeats, but these were different from the mysterious riders. These came with the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather, sounds that belonged to the daylight world of working ranchers. Martha and Elena hurried back toward the house, arriving to find Sheriff Crenshaw dismounting from his horse while 3 other men remained in their saddles. Martha recognized them as some of Samuel's associates, ranchers whose properties bordered hers and who had supported Samuel's claims in court. Mrs. Calloway, Sheriff Crenshaw called out as she approached, his voice carrying the formal tone that meant official business. I need to speak with you about a complaint that's been filed. Martha felt Elena's hand touch her elbow, a subtle gesture of support that reminded her she was no longer facing these challenges alone. What kind of complaint, Sheriff? Tom Bradley here says some of his cattle went missing last night, and the tracks lead toward your property. Crenshaw gestured toward one of the mounted men, a heavy-set rancher whose face showed the skeptical hostility Martha had come to expect from her neighbors. Bradley leaned forward in his saddle, his leather creaking with the movement. Found tracks this morning leading from my north pasture straight toward your land, Mrs. Calloway, 7 head missing, and I want to know what you intend to do about it. The accusation hit Martha like cold water. If Bradley's cattle had indeed wandered onto her property, she could be held legally responsible for their return or replacement. But if they had been taken by the same mysterious force that had been plaguing her own ranch, she had no way to prove her innocence. Sheriff, I haven't seen any stray cattle on my property. Elena and I have been checking the herds daily, and we would have noticed animals that didn't belong to us. That may be so, Crenshaw replied. But mister, Bradley has the right to search for his missing livestock. I'm here to ensure the search is conducted legally. Martha understood the implications immediately. A search of her property would reveal the reduced state of her own herds, and might uncover evidence that could be used to challenge her court victory. More importantly, if Bradley's cattle were found on her land, she could be charged with theft regardless of how they had gotten there. Of course, Sheriff. We have nothing to hide. The search party spread out across Martha's property with the systematic efficiency of men who knew their business. Martha and Elena followed at a distance, watching as the men examined water sources, checked fence lines, and counted the cattle they encountered. What they found was worse than Martha had feared. Not Bradley's missing cattle, but evidence that more of her own livestock had disappeared during the night. The eastern pasture, which should have held 12 head, was completely empty. "Mrs. Calloway," Sheriff Crenshaw said as the search party regrouped near the house, "your cattle counts don't match the numbers you provided to the court yesterday." Martha's mouth went dry. The legal implications were immediate and catastrophic. If she had provided false information to the court, her provisional approval could be revoked immediately. "Sheriff, those cattle were here yesterday evening when Elena and I made our count. I can't explain where they've gone." Bradley dismounted and approached with the confident stride of a man who smelled victory. "Sheriff, seems to me like Mrs. Calloway's been playing fast and loose with the truth. Maybe her missing cattle and mine disappeared together, if you catch my meaning." The suggestion hung in the air like gun smoke. Bradley was implying that Martha had sold cattle to cover her debts, while reporting them as still present for legal purposes. It was a serious charge that could result in criminal prosecution. "Now hold on," Elena said, stepping forward with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned respect through decades of honest work. "I was here when we counted those cattle yesterday, and I will swear to that in court." "No offense, Mrs. Vasquez," Bradley replied, "but you work for Mrs. Calloway now. Your word might not carry the same weight as an independent witness." Sheriff Crenshaw removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning hair, a gesture Martha had learned to recognize as a sign that he was weighing legal complexities against political pressures. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to need a full accounting of your livestock, with dates and witnesses for any recent sales or transfers. Until this matter is cleared up, you're under investigation for possible fraud and theft." The words hit Martha like physical blows, each syllable representing another step toward the loss of everything she had fought to preserve. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of official suspicion, she noticed Elena's expression had changed. The older woman was looking toward the eastern pasture with an intensity that suggested she had seen or understood something the men had missed. "Sheriff," Elena said quietly, "perhaps you should look at the tracks more carefully before you decide what happened here." Crenshaw followed Elena's gaze toward the eastern boundary, where the mesquite grove concealed the creek and the mysterious circle of hoofprints. "What kind of tracks, Mrs. Vasquez?" "The kind that might explain where all the missing cattle have gone, both Senora Calloway's and Senor Bradley's." Elena began walking toward the creek with the determined pace of a woman who had decided to reveal a dangerous secret. Martha hurried to catch up, her heart racing as she realized Elena was about to expose the supernatural elements that had been carefully kept out of legal proceedings. The search party followed reluctantly, their skepticism evident in muttered comments and exchanged glances. But when they reached the creek bed and saw the elaborate pattern of hoofprints that circled the warm earth, the muttering stopped. "Jesus Christ," Bradley whispered, his voice carrying a note of fear that hadn't been there moments before. The tracks were more extensive than Martha had realized, forming not just one circle, but multiple overlapping patterns that suggested hours of repetitive movement. More disturbing still, the prints showed no variation in depth or spacing, as if the horses that made them never tired, never stumbled, never broke their measured pace. Sheriff Crenshaw knelt beside the tracks, his experienced eyes noting details that civilian observers might miss. "These prints are fresh, maybe from last night, but I don't see any human footprints, no signs that riders ever dismounted." "There's more," Elena said, leading them to the cluster of stones that marked the ancient shrine. "This place has been sacred to the local people for generations. The cattle come here because they are called, and they do not leave because they cannot refuse the call." Bradley's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "Mrs. Vasquez, are you saying some kind of spirits are stealing our cattle?" "I am saying that debts must be paid, and agreements must be honored." "The cattle are not stolen, Senor Bradley. They are taken as payment for promises that were broken." The silence that followed Elena's words felt heavy with implications that none of the men wanted to acknowledge. Sheriff Crenshaw stood slowly, his knees creaking with the movement, and turned to face Martha with an expression that mixed official duty with personal uncertainty. "Mrs. Calloway, I need to ask you directly. Do you know anything about supernatural activities on your property?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, and Martha realized that her answer would determine not just her legal status but the direction of her entire future. She could deny everything, dismiss Elena's explanations as the superstitions of an uneducated woman, and hope that conventional investigation would clear her name. Or she could acknowledge the truth and risk being branded as either a liar or a lunatic. "Sheriff, I know that cattle have been disappearing from my property for months, and I know that the tracks we're looking at can't be explained by any natural causes. Whether you call that supernatural or just unexplained, I can't say. But I can promise you that I haven't stolen anyone's livestock." Crenshaw nodded slowly, but his expression suggested a man struggling with concepts that fell outside his normal experience. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to suspend the investigation pending further inquiry, but I want a full report of any additional incidents, and I want to be notified immediately if more cattle go missing." As the search party prepared to leave, Elena approached Martha with an expression that mixed relief and concern. "Senora Calloway, tonight is the full moon. If we are going to end this, it must be tonight." Martha felt her stomach tighten with anticipation and fear. "What do we have to do?" "We must restore the agreement your husband broke. We must make the offering and acknowledge the Guardian's authority over the water. It is the only way to stop the riders and protect what remains of your cattle." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades that reminded Martha of fire and blood. She had hours to prepare for a confrontation with forces she didn't fully understand, using knowledge she wasn't sure she believed. But as the hoofbeats began again in the distance, circling closer with each pass, Martha realized she had run out of conventional options. Tonight, she would either find a way to honor an ancient agreement or watch her ranch disappear one cow at a time into the realm of the supernatural. The full moon hung above the mesquite grove like a silver dollar suspended in black velvet, casting shadows that seemed to move with purposes of their own. Martha followed Elena through the darkness, her boots finding purchase on ground that felt increasingly unfamiliar despite her years of walking this same path. In her hands, she carried the offering Elena had insisted upon, a clay bowl filled with milk, honey, and cornmeal, ingredients that represented the bounty the land provided and the respect owed to whatever force governed its fertility. "The Guardian will expect you to speak for yourself," Elena whispered as they approached the circle of stones. "I can show you the proper forms, but the words must come from your heart, and you must mean every promise you make." Martha's chest tightened with the weight of approaching confrontation. The hoofbeats had been circling the ranch house for hours, growing louder and more insistent as the moon reached its zenith. Now, as they neared the creek, the sound seemed to come from all directions at once, as if an entire cavalry was converging on this single spot. "Elena, what happens if I can't do this? What happens if the Guardian refuses to accept my offering?" Elena's weathered face turned toward Martha in the moonlight, her dark eyes reflecting a knowledge earned through decades of living between two worlds. "Then the riders will come for more than cattle, and your ranch will become a place where nothing grows and no living thing can survive." They reached the circle of stones, and Martha gasped at what she saw. The ancient shrine had been transformed. The flat stone at the center now gleamed with moisture that caught the moonlight like liquid silver, and the surrounding rocks seemed to pulse with an inner warmth that made the air itself shimmer. More disturbing still, the ground around the shrine was covered with bones, cattle skulls arranged in precise patterns that suggested both offering and warning. "Those are from the missing cattle," Elena said, noting Martha's expression. "The guardian takes what is needed, but nothing is wasted. The bones return to mark the sacred space." Martha knelt beside the central stone and placed her offering bowl in the center, her hands trembling slightly as she felt the warmth that radiated up from the rock. The sensation was like touching something alive, something that pulsed with awareness and ancient patience. "What do I say? Speak as you would to any creditor who holds power over your future. With respect, but also with the strength of someone who understands her rights as well as her obligations." Martha closed her eyes and tried to find words for a conversation she had never imagined having. When she spoke, her voice carried across the water with a clarity that surprised her. "Guardian of this place, I am Martha Calloway, widow of Thomas Calloway, and I come to honor the agreement my husband failed to maintain. I offer what I can and ask for understanding of what is owed." The response came not as words, but as a sensation that filled Martha's mind like water flooding a dry creek bed. Images flashed through her consciousness. The land as it had been before fences and property lines, when native peoples had left offerings at this same shrine. The Spanish colonists who had learned to respect the old agreements. Generations of Mexican ranchers who had maintained the traditions even as the world changed around them. And finally, Thomas Calloway, dismissing the shrine as superstition and clearing away centuries of accumulated offerings. With the images came understanding. The guardian was not malevolent, but it was bound by laws older than human civilization. The water that gave life to the valley belonged to the earth itself, and those who used it without acknowledgement risked losing not just their cattle, but their connection to the land that sustained them. Martha opened her eyes and found herself facing something that existed at the edge of perception. Not quite solid, not entirely spirit, but unmistakably present. The guardian appeared as a shifting amalgamation of all the creatures that had ever depended on this water. The great buffalo that had once grazed these plains, the deer and antelope that still came to drink, the cattle that now carried the economic hopes of human families, and something else, something older and more fundamental than any individual species. "I understand," Martha said, her voice steady despite the impossible nature of the conversation. "My husband broke faith with you, and the debt has grown beyond simple offerings. What must I do to restore the balance?" The answer came as another flood of images and emotions. The guardian did not want to destroy the ranch or drive away the humans who had made their homes in the valley. But it required acknowledgement, respect, and a commitment to maintaining the ancient reciprocity that kept the water flowing and the grass growing. The price was steeper than Martha had expected. Not just monthly offerings, but a fundamental change in how the ranch operated. A portion of the land would need to be set aside as sacred space, protected from cattle and farming. The water rights would need to be shared with the wildlife that had depended on the creek for millennia. Most challenging of all, Martha would need to become a bridge between the human community and the older forces that governed the land, translating ancient requirements into modern practices. "I accept," Martha said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was accepting or whether she would be able to fulfill such complex obligations. The guardian's response was immediate and overwhelming. The ground beneath Martha's knees began to vibrate with increasing intensity, and the air filled with the sound of approaching hoofbeats from every direction. But instead of the menacing presence she had expected, the riders that emerged from the darkness carried an energy of completion and relief. They were not quite human, these mounted figures that circled the shrine with precision born of centuries of practice. Their horses moved with a grace that defied natural law, and their riders bore the faces of all the peoples who had ever honored this place. Native warriors with painted faces, Spanish colonists in leather armor, Mexican vaqueros with silver spurs, and something else, older and less human, that might have been the land's own memory of what it had been before history began. As the riders completed their circuit, Martha felt a change in herself, as profound as the transformation of the shrine. Knowledge flowed into her consciousness, like water filling a long, dry well. The locations of every spring and seasonal stream on the ranch, the migration patterns of the wildlife that depended on the water, the places where the land held power that must be respected and protected. With the knowledge came responsibility. Martha understood that she was now bound to the land in ways that went far beyond legal ownership. She was its guardian and translator, responsible for maintaining the balance between human needs and older claims. The ritual was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, these bearing riders who were unmistakably human. Martha turned to see torches moving through the darkness, carried by men who rode with the grim purpose of a search party or lynch mob. "Martha!" Samuel's voice carried across the water with a note of triumph that made Martha's blood run cold. "We know you're out here, and we know what you're doing." Elena grasped Martha's arm with urgent fingers. "They have come to stop you, but it is too late. The agreement is sealed, and they cannot break it." Martha stood and faced the approaching riders, her legs steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. Samuel led the group, flanked by Sheriff Crenshaw and several other ranchers, whose torches cast dancing shadows across the water. "Mrs. Calloway," Sheriff Crenshaw called out as the party reached the creek bank, "we received reports of disturbing activities on your property. I need you to step away from whatever you're doing and come with us." "Sheriff, I'm conducting legal activities on my own land." Samuel dismounted with violent energy, his boots hitting the ground like hammer blows. "Legal? Martha, you're practicing witchcraft or devil worship or God knows what kind of heathen nonsense. This ends now." The confrontation Martha had been dreading was finally upon her, but she found herself responding with a calm that surprised her. The knowledge the Guardian had shared included understanding of her legal rights and the limits of her neighbor's authority. "Samuel, my religious practices are protected by law, and my land use is governed by the court's decision. Unless you have evidence of actual criminal activity, you have no authority here." "Evidence?" Samuel's voice rose with indignation. "Martha, you've been stealing cattle and blaming it on ghosts. You've been conducting pagan rituals that terrify decent Christian people. That's evidence enough for any reasonable person." Sheriff Crenshaw stepped between them, his weathered hands raised in a gesture that called for calm. "Mrs. Calloway, I need to understand what's been happening here. The reports we've received suggest activities that go beyond normal ranching operations." Martha looked around the circle of men, noting their expressions of fear, suspicion, and hostility. These were her neighbors, people she had known for years, but they regarded her now as something dangerous and foreign. "Sheriff, I've been trying to solve the problem of disappearing cattle by learning about the traditional practices of the Mexican families who worked this land before us. Elena has been teaching me about water ceremonies and land blessing that might help protect the livestock." It was a carefully worded explanation that contained truth without revealing the full scope of what had occurred. Martha could see Crenshaw weighing her words against the political pressures represented by the men who surrounded him. "Mrs. Calloway, these traditional practices, do they involve supernatural elements that might frighten your neighbors?" The question was delicately phrased, giving Martha room to deny or minimize the supernatural aspects while acknowledging the community's concerns. But before she could answer, Elena stepped forward with the quiet authority of a woman who had decided to speak her truth regardless of consequences. Sheriff, this land has been sacred to my people for generations. The ceremonies we perform here are no different from the prayers you say in your church, except that ours are older and more closely connected to the earth that sustains all of us. Elena's words carried the weight of cultural authority, and Martha could see their effect on the gathered men. Several of them looked uncomfortable with the idea of interfering with religious practices, even if those practices differed from their own beliefs. But Samuel was not deterred by such considerations. Elena, you can dress this up in pretty words about tradition and religion, but what's happening here is cattle theft disguised as superstition. Martha's using your people's beliefs to cover up her criminal activities. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, and Martha realized that Samuel had found a way to attack both her and Elena simultaneously. By suggesting that Martha was exploiting Mexican traditions for criminal purposes, he could appear to respect cultural differences while still pressing his case for her removal. That's not true, Martha said, her voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had finally found solid ground to stand on. The ceremonies Elena has taught me are designed to protect the cattle, not steal them, and the results speak for themselves. As if summoned by her words, the sound of lowing cattle drifted across the water from the direction of the eastern pasture. Martha's heart leaped with sudden hope as she realized what the sound meant. Sheriff, I think you should check the eastern pasture. I believe you'll find that the missing cattle have returned. The search party moved toward the sound with the cautious excitement of men who had not expected their investigation to yield concrete results. What they found was more than Martha had dared to hope. Not just her own missing cattle, but Bradley's 7 head as well, all grazing peacefully in the moonlit pasture as if they had never been anywhere else. I'll be damned, Bradley muttered, his voice carrying amazement rather than suspicion. There they are, all of them, looking fat and happy as you please. Sheriff Crenshaw approached the cattle with the methodical care of a man trained to observe evidence. Mrs. Calloway, these animals show no signs of stress or mistreatment. Where have they been for the past several days? Martha met his gaze steadily, knowing that her answer would determine whether the night's events were seen as resolution or escalation. Sheriff, I believe they were protected by the same forces that brought them back. Elena's ceremonies have restored the natural balance that keeps the livestock safe. It was another carefully crafted answer that acknowledged the supernatural without claiming direct control over it. Martha could see Crenshaw weighing the implications, trying to find a way to close his investigation without having to officially recognize forces that fell outside legal jurisdiction. Mrs. Calloway, I'm satisfied that no theft has occurred. The missing cattle have been returned, and there's no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. However, I strongly advise you to avoid activities that might alarm your neighbors in the future. The sheriff's words represented a delicate compromise that allowed everyone to save face while acknowledging that something beyond normal explanation had occurred. But as the search party prepared to leave, Martha realized that her real challenges were just beginning. The Guardian had accepted her offering and restored the missing cattle, but the price of that acceptance was a lifetime commitment to maintaining traditions that most of her neighbors would never understand or accept. She was now bound to the land in ways that made her both more powerful and more vulnerable than she had ever been before. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity when Martha arrived for what everyone knew would be the final hearing on her ranch ownership. Word of the previous night's events had spread through Millfield like wildfire through dry grass, growing and changing with each telling, until the simple facts were buried beneath layers of speculation, fear, and religious fervor. Judge Webb had called the emergency session after receiving a formal complaint from the newly formed Citizens Committee for Community Standards, led by Samuel Hendricks and backed by signatures from 37 prominent townspeople. Martha walked through the crowd with Elena at her side, feeling the weight of every stare and whispered comment. The women pulled their shawls tighter and made small signs of the cross, while the men studied her with the careful attention reserved for dangerous animals. She wore her best black dress again, but now it felt less like mourning clothes and more like armor prepared for a final battle. "Mrs. Calloway," Judge Webb began once the courtroom had achieved something resembling order, "this court has received serious allegations regarding activities on your property that may constitute a threat to public safety and community standards. You have the right to respond to these charges before I make my final determination regarding your ranch ownership." Samuel stood at the plaintiff's table surrounded by documents and witnesses, his face showing the confident satisfaction of a man who believed victory was within his grasp. Behind him sat representatives from every major ranch in the county, united for perhaps the first time in their shared conviction that Martha Calloway had crossed a line that could not be ignored. "Your Honor," Samuel began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of prepared remarks, "the evidence will show that Mrs. Calloway has engaged in practices that endanger both livestock and human safety. Last night's events prove that she cannot maintain order on her property, and that her activities pose a direct threat to neighboring ranches." Judge Webb studied the papers before him with the weary attention of a man who had hoped to avoid making the kind of decision that would define his legacy. "Mr. Hendricks, please present your evidence." Samuel's first witness was Tom Bradley, who testified that his cattle had disappeared mysteriously and reappeared just as inexplicably after Martha's nighttime ritual. His testimony was careful and factual, but the implications were clear. Martha possessed some form of supernatural power that allowed her to control livestock that did not belong to her. "Mr. Bradley," Judge Webb asked, "are you suggesting that Mrs. Calloway used supernatural means to steal and return your cattle?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "Your Honor, I'm not saying I understand what happened. But I know my cattle disappeared from my land and showed up on hers after she performed some kind of ceremony at midnight. That's not natural, and it's not right." The next witness was Reverend Marcus Stone from the First Baptist Church, a thin man with burning eyes who spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted his own righteousness. His testimony focused on the spiritual dangers represented by Martha's activities. "Your Honor, what we witnessed last night was devil worship, plain and simple. Mrs. Calloway has made a pact with dark forces, and the entire community is now at risk of supernatural retaliation. Good Christian families cannot be expected to live in fear of witchcraft and demon summoning." Martha felt Elena tense beside her as Reverend Stone's words fell across the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples of fear and anger that spread through the assembled crowd. The religious dimension of the accusations made them far more dangerous than simple charges of theft or property damage. When her turn came to respond, Martha stood with the quiet dignity of a woman who had found her ground and intended to hold it regardless of cost. She had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing for this moment, knowing that her words would determine not just her own fate, but the precedent for how the community would treat anyone who stepped outside accepted boundaries. "Your Honor, I stand accused of practicing witchcraft because I learned about the traditional land management practices of the Mexican families who have worked these ranches for generations. I am accused of supernatural cattle theft because livestock that had wandered away returned to their proper pastures after I participated in a water blessing ceremony that has been performed in this valley for over 200 years. Martha paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom before continuing. "The question before this court is not whether my neighbors approve of my religious practices, but whether those practices violate any actual law or cause any actual harm. The missing cattle have been returned unharmed. No property has been damaged. No person has been threatened or injured. The only thing that has been disturbed is the assumption that there is only one acceptable way to live, work in this community." Judge Webb leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped before him. "Mrs. Calloway, Are you claiming that your activities were purely religious in nature? Yes, Your Honor. I am claiming that I have the same right to practice my beliefs as Reverend Stone has to practice his. The First Amendment protects religious freedom, and Texas law recognizes the validity of traditional practices that do not harm others. Samuel rose with the sharp energy of a man who had been waiting for this opening. Your Honor, Mrs. Calloway cannot claim religious protection for practices that endanger the community. Her activities have terrorized neighbors, caused livestock to behave unnaturally, and created an atmosphere of fear that threatens the stability of our entire region. Mr. Hendricks, can you provide evidence of actual harm rather than community disapproval? The question hung into the air like smoke from a campfire, and Martha could see Samuel struggling to find concrete damages that would justify legal action. His case was strong on fear and suspicion, but weak on demonstrable harm. Your Honor, the harm is in the precedent. If we allow Mrs. Calloway to continue these practices, we open the door for every kind of superstitious nonsense and foreign influence. Our community has standards, and those standards exist to protect decent Christian families from exactly this kind of threat. Judge Webb was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between the legal documents and the faces of the people who had come to witness what they expected would be Martha's final defeat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of a man walking between competing pressures. Mrs. Calloway, while I cannot find legal grounds to prohibit your religious practices, this court is concerned about the effect of those practices on community harmony. Therefore, I am prepared to offer a compromise solution. Martha's heart began to beat faster as she sensed the direction of the judge's thinking. You may retain ownership of your ranch, but you will be required to cease all activities that involve supernatural elements or traditional practices that disturb your neighbors. You will manage your property according to conventional ranching methods, and you will refrain from any further ceremonies or rituals that might alarm the community. The proposed compromise was both victory and defeat, allowing Martha to keep her land while forcing her to abandon the spiritual connection that had made that victory possible. She could see Elena's face from the corner of her eye, noting the older woman's expression of quiet disappointment. Your Honor, with respect, you are asking me to abandon practices that are essential to the proper management of my land. The ceremonies I have learned are not entertainment or rebellion. They are practical techniques for maintaining the balance between human activity and natural forces. Mrs. Calloway, this court cannot recognize supernatural forces as legitimate factors in land management decisions. Martha took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either secure her future or destroy it entirely. Your Honor, I respectfully decline your compromise. I will not abandon practices that have proven effective in protecting my livestock and maintaining my property. If that means losing my ranch, then that is a price I am prepared to pay for the right to practice my beliefs freely. The silence that followed Martha's declaration felt heavy enough to crush the courthouse walls. Judge Webb stared at her with an expression that mixed surprise, admiration, and concern. Mrs. Calloway, are you certain you want to reject this court's offer? The alternative may be complete loss of your property. I am certain, Your Honor. I would rather lose my ranch as a free woman than keep it as a prisoner of other people's fears. Samuel's face showed the triumphant satisfaction of a man who had maneuvered his opponent into an impossible position. But before Judge Webb could respond to Martha's declaration, the courthouse doors swung open with enough force to draw every eye in the room. Sheriff Crenshaw entered with the purposeful stride of a man carrying urgent news, followed by 3 Mexican men whose presence caused a stir of surprised murmurs throughout the courtroom. Martha recognized them as members of the Vasquez family and other long-established ranching families whose voices had rarely been heard in official proceedings. Your Honor, Sheriff Crenshaw said, approaching the bench with documents in his weathered hands. I apologize for the interruption, but new information has come to light that bears directly on these proceedings. Judge Webb accepted the papers with raised eyebrows. Sheriff, what kind of information? Your Honor, These gentlemen have come forward with historical documentation regarding land use agreements that predate current property deeds. They claim that Mrs. Calloway's activities are not only legal, but required under original territorial agreements that are still binding under federal law. The courtroom erupted in surprised conversation as the implications of the sheriff's words began to sink in. Martha felt Elena's hand squeeze her arm in a gesture of quiet triumph, but she kept her expression carefully neutral as she watched Judge Webb examine the documents. The papers the Mexican ranchers had brought were old, some written in Spanish on parchment that showed the brown stains of age and careful preservation. As Judge Webb studied them, his expression grew increasingly troubled. "Sheriff, these documents appear to be original Spanish land grants with provisions for traditional water rights and indigenous practices. If authentic, they would indeed create binding obligations that transcend individual property ownership." Samuel's confident expression cracked like ice under spring sun. "Your Honor, surely you cannot give legal weight to foreign documents and pagan superstitions." "Mr. Hendricks, these are not foreign documents. They are territorial agreements recognized by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which means they carry the force of federal law. If Mrs. Calloway's activities fall under the protection of these agreements, then this court has no authority to prohibit them." Martha felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized that the battle she had thought she was fighting alone had actually been part of a larger struggle between different legal traditions and cultural authorities. The Mexican families had been waiting, watching, preparing to act when the moment was right. Elena stood and addressed the court with the quiet dignity of a woman speaking for her people's rights. "Your Honor, the ceremonies Senora Calloway has learned are not her invention or rebellion. They are legal obligations that come with the land, recorded in documents that your government promised to honor when it took possession of this territory." Judge Webb set down the historical papers and looked around the courtroom with the expression of a man who had discovered that his simple property dispute had become a complex question of federal treaty law and cultural sovereignty. "This court will need time to examine these documents and determine their legal standing. Until that examination is complete, I am suspending all proceedings regarding Mrs. Calloway's property rights." Samuel's face had gone pale with the realization that his carefully planned victory was slipping away. "Your Honor, you cannot allow foreign law to override American property rights." "Mr. Hendricks, I am not allowing foreign law to override anything. I am acknowledging that American law includes treaties and agreements that may be more complex than any of us initially understood." As the courtroom began to empty amid confused conversations and heated arguments, Martha found herself surrounded by the Mexican families who had come forward to support her case. Their presence represented something she had never expected: acceptance into a community that transcended the boundaries of race and language. "Senora Calloway," Elena said as they walked toward the courthouse steps, "you have given us something we have waited generations for. A chance to have our rights recognized in an American court." Martha looked back at the courthouse, where Judge Webb was still examining the historical documents that might determine the future of property rights throughout the region. The legal battle was far from over, but something fundamental had changed in the balance of power between old ways and new authorities. The sun was setting as Martha and Elena rode back toward the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Martha of the fires that forge metal into stronger forms. Behind them, the sounds of heated argument still echoed from the courthouse steps, but ahead lay the quiet certainty of land that had finally found its voice. 3 months after the courthouse confrontation, Martha stood on her porch, watching a sight that would have been impossible to imagine when she first faced Sheriff Crenshaw's auction block. A delegation of ranchers from 3 counties had come to learn about the traditional water management practices that had transformed the Calloway Ranch from a failing operation into one of the most prosperous spreads in the region. Judge Webb's investigation had concluded that the historical land agreements were indeed legally binding, creating a precedent that rippled far beyond Martha's property lines. More importantly, the dramatic improvement in her cattle's health and the reliable flow of her creek during the worst drought in 20 years had attracted attention from practical men who cared more about results than the methods used to achieve them. "Mrs. Calloway," said Robert Harrison, a prominent rancher from Brazos County whose own water sources had been failing. "I'll be honest with you. I don't pretend to understand everything about these traditional practices, but I can't argue with success. My cattle are dying while yours are thriving." Martha descended the porch steps to meet the gathered ranchers, noting how their attitudes had shifted from suspicion to cautious respect. These were men who had once supported Samuel's efforts to drive her from the valley, but drought and desperation had opened their minds to possibilities they would have rejected under normal circumstances. "Mr. Harrison, the practices Elena has taught me are not mysterious or supernatural. They're simply ways of working with the land rather than against it, techniques developed over centuries by people who understood that human prosperity and natural health are connected." Elena emerged from the house, carrying a tray of coffee and the maps she had prepared to illustrate the water ceremony locations and their relationship to seasonal flow patterns. Her presence no longer caused the uncomfortable shuffling it once had. The ranchers had learned to associate her knowledge with practical solutions to their mounting problems. "Gentlemen," Elena said, setting down the tray with practiced efficiency, "the ceremonies we perform are like maintenance on a windmill or repairs to a fence. They keep the natural systems working properly so that human systems can function as well." The explanation was carefully crafted to appeal to men who understood mechanical relationships even if they struggled with spiritual concepts. Martha had learned to translate ancient wisdom into language that modern ranchers could accept without feeling that they were abandoning their cultural identities. Thomas Bradley, whose cattle had been among the first to disappear and return, stepped forward with the measured confidence of a man who had tested new ideas and found them worthwhile. "Mrs. Calloway, I've been working with Mrs. Vasquez's nephew to establish ceremony sites on my property, and I can report that we haven't lost a single head of cattle since the full moon ritual last month." The testimonial carried weight because it came from a man whose skepticism had been well documented during the courthouse proceedings. Other ranchers nodded thoughtfully, calculating the potential benefits against the risks of being associated with practices their neighbors might still view with suspicion. "The question," said James Morrison, a younger rancher who had inherited his father's spread but not his father's rigid thinking, "is whether we can implement these practices without causing the kind of community uproar that Mrs. Calloway faced." It was a practical concern that went to the heart of the social changes rippling through the region. The legal recognition of traditional land agreements had created space for different approaches to ranch management, but social acceptance lagged behind legal protection. "Mr. Morrison," Martha said, "the key is education and gradual implementation. Elena and I have been working with the Mexican families to document the practices in ways that emphasize their practical benefits. We're not asking anyone to abandon their religious beliefs or cultural identity just to expand their understanding of effective land management." The approach Martha described represented a careful balance between preserving traditional knowledge and making it accessible to people from different cultural backgrounds. The documentation project had become a collaboration between Elena's community and progressive ranchers who recognized that survival in an increasingly challenging environment required new tools and old wisdom. Sheriff Crenshaw arrived as the meeting was concluding, his presence no longer carrying the threat it once had, but still commanding attention from the assembled ranchers. His investigation of the historical land agreements had earned him recognition as an expert on territorial law, and his support for Martha's practices carried significant weight in legal and political circles. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years, "I have news from Austin that you'll want to hear." The ranchers gathered closer, sensing that official news might affect their own situations as much as Martha's. Sheriff Crenshaw removed his hat and wiped his forehead with a gesture that suggested the importance of his announcement. The territorial agreements you've been operating under have been formally recognized by the federal court system as binding legal precedents. That means similar agreements throughout Texas and the Southwestern Territories are now subject to review and potential enforcement. The implications of the sheriff's words rippled through the assembled men like stones dropped into still water. If traditional land agreements carried legal force throughout the region, then many current property arrangements might need to be reconsidered to account for obligations and rights that had been ignored for generations. "Sheriff," Robert Harrison asked, "what does this mean for ranchers who want to implement traditional practices on their own land?" "It means you have legal protection to do so. And it also means you may have legal obligations to honor agreements your predecessors made but didn't document properly in deed transfers." The legal complexity of the situation was daunting, but it also represented opportunity for ranchers who had been struggling with conventional methods. Martha could see the calculations playing out behind the men's eyes as they weighed potential benefits against unknown risks. As the delegation prepared to leave, Elena approached Martha with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen justice delayed but not denied. "Senora Calloway, there is something I must tell you now, that the immediate danger has passed. The guardian that we made agreement with, it has been waiting for generations for someone who could serve as a bridge between the old ways and the new people. You were chosen for this role before you ever knew it existed." Martha felt a chill despite the afternoon warmth. "Elena, are you saying that Thomas's death and all the events that followed were somehow planned?" "Not planned, exactly. But the Guardian works with the patterns that exist, guiding them toward outcomes that serve the land's long-term health. Your husband's rejection of the old agreements created the crisis, but your willingness to learn and adapt created the solution." The revelation was both comforting and troubling, suggesting that Martha's struggles had been part of a larger pattern she was only beginning to understand. But as she watched the departing ranchers discussing implementation plans and resource sharing, she realized that her individual story had become part of something much larger. That evening, as Martha sat on her porch reviewing correspondence from ranchers, lawyers, and government officials who wanted to learn about traditional land management practices, she heard the familiar sound of approaching hoofbeats. But now the sound carried no threat, only the quiet acknowledgement of agreements honored and obligations met. The riders that emerged from the darkness were fewer in number than during the crisis months, and their presence felt more like a benediction than a warning. They circled the house once, paused at the creek where the shrine stones caught moonlight like gathered stars, then faded into the night with the satisfied dignity of guardians whose vigil had been successful. Elena joined Martha on the porch, bringing coffee and the comfortable silence of women who had shared danger and emerged stronger for the experience. "The riders come less often now," Elena observed. "But they still come. See, they will always come, because the agreement is not just for this generation, but for all the generations that will follow. You have accepted responsibility not just for your ranch, but for maintaining the balance between human needs and the older claims." Martha sipped her coffee and considered the weight of that responsibility. Her ranch was more prosperous than it had ever been, her legal position was secure, and her influence was growing throughout the region. But she was also bound to the land in ways that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. A letter from the territorial governor requesting a formal presentation on traditional land management practices lay open on her lap, representing opportunities she could never have imagined when she first stood on the courthouse steps facing an impossible debt. But success had brought new challenges and deeper obligations that would test her wisdom as much as her courage. "Elena, do you think I made the right choice? Trading a conventional life for whatever this has become?" Elena's weathered face turned toward Martha in the lamplight, her dark eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had spent her life navigating between worlds. "Senora Calloway, You did not trade one life for another. You discovered the life you were always meant to live, the one that serves purposes larger than your individual survival. In the distance, coyotes began their evening song, and Martha realized she could now distinguish their calls from the subtler sounds of the night spirits that also moved through the darkness. The knowledge Elena had shared had opened her senses to layers of existence she had never suspected, making her both more connected to the land and more responsible for its welfare. The next morning brought a letter that would have terrified Martha 6 months earlier, but now filled her with quiet anticipation. Samuel Hendricks requested a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding property management and community relations. Martha smiled as she folded the letter, understanding that her brother-in-law's request represented not surrender, but recognition of changed circumstances. The balance of power in the valley had shifted, and even Samuel was smart enough to adapt to new realities when the alternative was irrelevance. The transformation of the Dust Ranch widow from desperate debtor to regional authority had taken less than a year, but Martha knew the real work was just beginning. She had opened a door between worlds that had been separate for too long, and keeping that door open would require constant vigilance, continuous learning, and the wisdom to balance competing interests without betraying the deeper agreements that made prosperity possible. As she prepared for another day of correspondence, meetings, and the endless small ceremonies that maintained her connection to the forces that governed the land, Martha reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by accepting obligations she had never chosen but could no longer imagine living without. The dust that had given the ranch its name still rose from the roads and pastures, but now it carried the scent of rain that came when needed and grass that grew stronger each season. The widow who had faced impossible odds alone had become the bridge that connected past wisdom to future possibilities, ensuring that the land would support life for generations yet to come. In the eastern pasture, cattle grazed peacefully under the morning sun, protected by agreements older than written law and stronger than human fear. The Dust Ranch had found its voice, and the valley would never be the same.